I'm somebody who has two drastically different art styles when it comes to traditional versus digital art. And as much as I've tried, I've never been able to make those two very different styles coexist or meet in the middle in some way. That is, until I discovered this program. Rebelle Pro claims to have the most realistic traditional painting experience in a digital art program possible. They boast realistic mediums and tools like oil paint with impasto, watercolor with granulation, palette knife tools, dirty brush mixing, and canvas interaction. Their watercolor movement and blending is said to be the most realistic in a digital platform there is. And the thing that intrigued me the most is their advertised pigment color mixing, which is supposed to emulate how physical pigments mix. Instead of blending blue and yellow and it going straight across the color wheel through a gross grayish-green color, it acts like real pigments would and turns into a vibrant green. So, did this program solve all of my problems and turn my disparity between traditional and digital art into a cohesive art style? Let's find out. Normally, when I paint traditionally, I'm using gouache or acrylic gouache, which is really just acrylics with a mattifying agent mixed in. However, Rebelle Pro 5 doesn't have an option for gouache, and their option for opaque watercolors doesn't really match the experience I have with gouache. I actually like to compare gouache as being closest in feel to oil paints. This is because oils have a long open time, which means they stay wet for a long time and you can blend with them. And while gouache dries quickly, the way it reactivates when wet means you get a similar sort of blending effect when you layer, as you would with oils. So in Rebelle, instead of using the acrylics or watercolor option, I opted to use oils. I also found this menu that lets you change certain properties about the paint you apply, and turning down the shininess option made the oil paint tool take on an appearance similar to gouache. That got the program to at least emulate the medium I'm familiar with, though I still found myself struggling with colors until I watched a bunch of tutorials on the Escape Motions YouTube channel and discovered that I was using the program entirely wrong. You see, Rebelle has that feature I mentioned earlier, where colors blend as their real-world pigment counterparts would. But that feature is a toggle, and that toggle is turned off by default. It's a very simple thing to turn on the layers panel, and once I realized it was turned off, and I fixed it by turning it on, all the colors on my mixing palette turned so much more vibrant than they were. The ones on the canvas didn't change, since those were already applied, but I was able to paint over those easily. I do think it's a bit silly that this feature is turned off by default when it's so highly advertised, but mixing colors with it turned on produces beautiful results. Speaking of that mixing palette I mentioned, I love this thing. When you paint in real life, you often mix colors on a palette instead of mixing on the canvas or on paper. Though I will be the first to admit that I also do mix on the canvas, even though you're not supposed to. With the mixing palette in Rebelle, you can replicate this process and have pre-mixed blends of colors as if you were painting in real life. I do sort of wish the actual painting and mixing worked in the palette like it does in the canvas in Rebelle, but I understand why having cleaner colors and mixes in the palette would be more useful. I also had a bit of trouble with the brush tools themselves, and getting one that didn't feel super digital in a way. The impasto texture felt like too much of a synthetic pattern applied on top of the color, rather than a natural result of bristles on a brush. And choosing whether to have the messy brush option, multicolor brush option, both or neither on was honestly kind of a chore. Between those options, and the subtle but important difference between paint and mix mode versus paint and blend mode, it felt like there were too many options and none of them worked quite the way I wanted. Turning messy brush and multicolor brush on was causing me to drag color around into places I didn't want, and it felt like too much of that effect. I understand what it's trying to emulate, where when you drag your brush through the color blue, if you have red on your brush, it's going to track a little bit of blue through with it and it'll eventually blend into kind of a purple. But it never felt like it acted that way, or at least it didn't feel like it acted the way it would in real life. It also didn't seem like Messy Brush and Multicolor Brush reacted to pen pressure, where in real life, it would. If you dragged your brush through a color lightly, only a little bit of it would pick up on your brush, whereas if you drug your brush deeply through that color, a lot more would track in real life. But in Rebelle, it seemed to drag the exact same amount of color on your brush, no matter what pen pressure you were using. I eventually settled on using paint and blend mode with both Messy Brush and Multicolor Brush turned off, and that mostly seemed to get the effect that I wanted. When painting in real life, you can dip your paintbrush in water, or solvent if you're using oils, to clean it, and start with a fresh color on a clean brush. Or you have the option of taking the color already on your brush and mixing it into your palette with a new color. I would have liked to see some kind of feature emulating that action. Instead, you just had to use the color picker like a normal digital painting app, and that added to the feeling of the program being too digital. The other thing I noticed while playing with different tools is that the watercolor engine, which it feels like every artist I've seen has gushed about, doesn't behave anywhere near how I would expect watercolor to act. For one, I never got the blow air function to work, which is supposed to let you move the watercolor as if you were blowing on it with a straw. I'm not sure if that's some hardware issue on my end, because it just seemed like my computer couldn't handle it. No hard loss there, I never liked that effect much in real life. But as for the watercolor blending and bleeding patterns themselves, the water always seemed way too heavy. Even with the tilt function turned fairly minimum, it was always dragging and dripping too much. The pigment would pool and become very concentrated in specific places, rather than spreading out like you would expect. And turning the granulation function on would make it behave very strangely and become almost pixely. You can watch that happen here. It felt often like the watercolor pigment would bounce to the edges of the wet area and then bounce back in and almost double up on itself, and it was just very strange. I just don't think this quite lived up to all the hype, though it is far more realistic than any other watercolor brush I've used in any other painting program, which those simply always have the effect of darkening the edges of the painting area. This outshines that by a mile. But being digital isn't all bad. Towards the end of my painting process, I was able to make a new layer and set it to overlay mode, like a regular digital app, and use that to bring out some extra color and vibrancy in my painting. I wouldn't have been able to do that with traditional media, especially with gouache. That would have just made a mess. But blending modes are a staple of my digital painting process, and being able to use them on something more traditional appearing meant I was able to meld the two techniques into something that was greater than the sum of its parts. The other benefit to this being a digital program is that you can do things like use colored pencil over top of quote-unquote oils, which you would absolutely not be able to do in real life. That would be really bad for your painting. Or heck, you could even use watercolor over oils, which would be physically impossible in real life because the watercolor would just bead up and run off your painting. So this lets you have even more of a mixed media sort of look and approach than anything in real life would let you do. In the end, I think I'm going to have to give this program another go using everything I learned in the first painting. I don't think it'll replicate either my traditional process or my digital process, but it's an enjoyable way to paint and it'll be a good break from the monotony of my usual process. What do you think about this program? Would it replace traditional art for you? Thank you so much for watching today's video, and if you want to see how I made art to sell in vending machines, click here. Till next time, take care.